Hi everyone, my name's Jad, and I read Franny by J.D. Salinger so that you don't have to. J.D. Salinger is also the author of Catcher in the Rye, a book that you've probably heard about or you probably read in high school. If you haven't read Catcher in the Rye, I highly recommend that you read it. If you haven't read Franny yet, I highly recommend that you read it as well. They're both incredible. Franny is an incredible short story, and Catcher in the Rye is an incredible novel. Both of these stories were written in the 1950s and the 60s. Actually, Catcher in the Rye was written over the course of, I think, a decade or two. Incredible stories, very evocative, especially Franny, I would say. The character is quite unique. Or the way that the story is told is an incredibly unique experience. And I'm going to talk about that just for a little while. So I'll ask a couple of questions right off the bat. The typical ones: who, what, where, when, why. Who is this story about? Well, we know it's Franny. There we go. Let me just change my color. Franny, we would say, is a college student. That's, I would think between the age of 18 and 20. What? Well, there's an event going on, specifically a Yale game. We can assume that it's football, American football, that is. And she's going to visit her boyfriend and attend the Yale game in New England. And particularly, if it's a Yale game, we can assume that it's Connecticut. When is the story set? I would wager it's the 1950s. I would also just say more specifically, it's post-World War II. And why? And what I have for my why is to explore Franny's state of mind and her relationship to her boyfriend, who is called Lane. So that's my main idea, and I'll go into some detail by reading an essay that I wrote about this story. So right away from the first paragraph, you can see that Salinger forges a really specific type of reality. There's no wasted time, he just jumps right into it, very similar to Catcher in the Rye. Since this story came out in 1951, or was published in 1955, we can see that Catcher in the Rye and the voice is quite similar here. You can definitely tell that it's the same author, the same narrative style, which is a great way to jump into J.D. Salinger by reading a short story like Franny, if you don't have the time to read Catcher in the Rye, which is a full-fledged novel. We can see right at the beginning of the story, quote, Saturday morning was overcoat weather again. And this is a precise way that the narrator in the story illustrates a world in which weather plays a role in determining a force of, mirroring character mood, but also how characters perceive their luck, how they perceive their lives, and the prospects of their day, especially when there's a sporting event like a Yale game that's expected to take place. Everything depends on the weather in the story. And by everything, it means the game, the weekend of the game. So Salinger's reality in the story is small and exclusive. We would say it's a great example of the New England college town that he depicts. Although small and isolated, it's not really secluded, though, because Salinger's narrator wants us to know that what goes on in here is infinitely more important than anything else that's going on. So we could kind of think about it as like a microcosm. Isolated, but not really secluded from the reality. The seclusion or the isolation is much more of a mental, cultural intellectual isolation. So no news from the world could shroud this weekend in gloom. We're kind of in a snow globe reality, a snow globe world where the only trouble on the horizon is literal rain clouds, or for someone to metaphorically shake the snow globe. So what could be more important than this Yale game, we're sort of begged to consider. And of course, something is much more important than the Yale game. Lane, Franny's beau, or boyfriend in this case, is utterly consumed by making it on time to the game. That's his primary objective of the story. He wants to see his friends, he wants to see the game, he wants to be involved. It's an event that would be unacceptable to miss, devastating even, and it would take a true emergency, a true crisis to prevent him from attending this game. And the entire story is centered around this event because it's an inevitability. They've been planning for this. Not as fearful an inevitability as death, but urgent and important. It's a social appointment for Lane, for Franny. Franny going to see Lane. This is an incredibly sort of a momentous occasion for them. And everything is, for teenagers and college students, everything is of the utmost importance all the time. But is it more important than Franny's panic attack? Or maybe we would call it a nervous breakdown, something that a term they would use in the 1950s? Because that's exactly what happens in the story. Franny has a type of crisis. Something is building up through the story as they sit for lunch. And I'll talk about that in a little more detail right now. The point is that the game is happening today, and preparations must be and have been made. So we know that the characters have planned well for this day, starting from the droves of young men, the college students waiting at the train station at precisely 10:52 a.m. in the cold for their girlfriends and guests to join them. And there exists certainty in the way that things are. Little doubt exists in the reality. The narrator tells us to dive right in. The narrator shows us that the young men of this reality, quote, sounded collegiately dogmatic, end quote, standing smoking in the waiting room. And this one particular quotation is invaluable. It's a really great piece of insight when paired with the end of the story. At that moment, at the end, Lane asks Franny if she actually believes this stuff, in quotations, when referring to the information that she's talking about from a religious textbook that she's studying at college. It's this idea between dogma, or apparently sounding dogmatic, as if everything is true, everything coming out of your mouth is true, and then Franny's idea that, well, yes, things coming out of your mouth could be true, you could discuss dogma, you could relate facts and truths, but really, how she replies to Lane's question is, quote, I didn't say I believed it or I didn't believe it, end quote. And this response captures the ambivalence or ambiguity of what we, as a reader, or as Franny, or as Lane, take as what's real. For it hardly matters what's being said, like the young men smoking in the train waiting room, but really what is more important is how it's believed, or what is believed. What are you saying, and how people, how is it leaving an impression on someone? And as the story goes, Franny visits Lane for the weekend, and she's impressing upon him. The sort of message that she's sending is, I have feelings for you. However, Salinger's story attacks this premise because because something is a certain way doesn't always mean that it is the way it is. Every great story, and Franny is a great example of this, needs to go awry. And how does it go awry? In broad strokes, Franny's problem is that she begins to question herself. And the question that she ends up asking, the question that lies within this religious textbook that she carries around with her, is, do your actions dictate who you are, or do you dictate your actions? And while Lane simply wants to know what the answer is, the result, as though it's some sort of mathematical equation, Franny tries to address the gestalt. What I mean here is kind of that one's life is composed of a whole experience made up of the sum of its parts. And this idea is something I feel like everyone can get into, whether you're a teenager thinking about your life and what it will be, whether you're middle-aged considering how your life has been going and how you'd like to spend the rest of it, or whether you're a senior citizen and thinking about how you have lived your life. What are the experiences and how have they come together? Which is like the entire effect of the short story, Franny, taken from such an idea. It addresses the split between those living well thought out and planned lives, those planning, and then committing to their plans, and those like Franny, who, they have planned, they've attempted to find order in their life, but they're doubtful. They face doubt, they face emotional turbulence and existential angst. That the most important thing to consider is that it can't be explained. They don't know why. Franny doesn't understand why she feels like that. And this is what she means throughout the story when she apologizes and she says, I feel so funny, she quotes, and, quote, I think I'm going crazy, end quote. The main takeaway from these types of sentences that Franny says is that she doesn't doubt how she feels. She knows she's feeling crazy, but what she isn't aware of is why she is. While this time she's kind of dismissive of her own feelings, even though she is at the same time expressing her feelings, and she's trying to voice it to Lane. It's a problem that I believe most of us experience, when we're feeling some sort of suffering, surrounded by people, particularly people we're trying to impress or we're trying not to worry. We acknowledge it, but then we kind of brush it under the rug, and we say, no, nothing to see here. I'm suffering, but it's fine. And one of the best ways that Salinger's narrator highlights this contrast between Lane and Franny, someone, Lane, predictable, loves predictability, and then Franny, someone who's a little, has an aversion to predictability, doesn't really feel comfortable with it, doesn't feel comfortable though. And of course, I'm not necessarily suggesting that this is the only way to frame these two characters, but I believe that it's a great way to just cut to the chase and not talk about everything that this novel can possess. So let's talk about Lane for a second. Lane is a great name because it conjures this idea of like a narrow road that threads the wide open countryside in places like New England. Something that we would consider now like a one-car road. You have to like pull off to the side to let someone else pass. Kind of like the way that they have their conversation. Lane talks, Franny listens, Franny talks, Lane listens. They have to kind of take turns, and if they do reach an impasse, that is that problem. They don't know where to go from there. And, Lane lives a predictable life. He seems pretty content. He has his own worldview. He's a clever young man, and he knows it. One imagines that he's got a loving family. The sort of that old-fashioned 20th century term, like good breeding, comes to mind. We can imagine that he attends, a good university. We can maybe suggest that he attends Yale. And he thinks he's above it all. He thinks he's better than the rest, and that's a pretty clear idea. He's convinced that he's got something to say, and he wrote an essay, he wrote a paper that he really thinks speaks some sort of wisdom, and he wants to share it with people. And, of course, he just wants to convince Franny. He wants to get Franny's opinion. Do you think I'm as smart as I think I am? Which is a great way of sort of capturing how college students, particularly, in this case, a young man, would think. And he wants to get some sort of confirmation that he is special. He knows, or he's under the assumption that Franny loves him, admires him, but he wants to know, is it as much as I admire myself? And so here comes Franny to destroy it. Which again, it's this great setup and breakdown. Franny comes and rains on his parade. He feels the stab of inferiority when Franny calls him, quote, a session man, which is kind of what we can understand it to be like some sort of charlatan or egoist, which is perhaps a pretty truthful evaluation of who Lane is. And this reference calls to mind the attack on critics that took place in the mid-century in America and in the arts scene. And it was kind of argued at that time that all critics did was explain why things were either of no value or of value, and they were kind of the taste makers. But they never really created art themselves, or in the most case, their art was not necessarily considered as important as their criticism. And it's refreshing to witness Franny chipping away at Lane's ego, and it's even humanizing to see him hurt and reflect on his sort of fragile masculinity, as we might call it today, especially just having heard him accuse someone of lacking in, quote, testicularity, quote, which is a really funny term that Salinger uses in this book. And now at least sort of Lane is open and maybe receptive to being being criticized himself, reflexivity, to analyzing things in a new way, but the excessive navel gazing that could be the peril of that excessive self-reflexivity is kind of what we see with Franny. So as Lane could start to say, okay, well, like, let me open my mind up a little bit to think about myself, we can see that Franny is kind of way, way, way on the other side, too involved in thinking about herself, of thinking too critically, and the peril is arriving at some sort of existential crisis. So back to Franny. While we're waiting for Franny to arrive in her train, Lane reads her letter, and it's in this letter that we can tell that Franny's life is sort of wrought in literal chaos, and she can hardly get her thoughts in order. You know, her dorm room's really loud. She can't really compose this letter. So she apologizes for this, even though it's far out of her control, just like a lot of things are. You know, she actually apologizes several times throughout the story, especially when she gets to lunch with Lane. Her apologizing is excessive, and then Lane even insists, you know, that she just quits it, that she stops when they're at Sickler's for lunch. He's tired of seeing her sweat. He's tired of seeing her suffer and censure herself. And here we see that conflict between Franny, that internal conflict, who has an overactive analytical mind, constantly measuring herself, reeling herself back from her own boundaries, engaging in a sort of tug of war with herself, and the result of which is a rending of herself. Her sort of fabric starts to tear, metaphorically speaking. And the split in her character appears even before her physicality does. And before we start to see her, we can see that there is some sort of split happening with her. In her letter, she signs her name 2 times. Once she signs it as Franny. We could say that this is symbolic of who she is. I'm Franny. You know, this is why the title of the story is called Franny. And then she signs her name again. The last time she signs it as Francis, which is kind of a way of saying Francis is perhaps over there. That's not Franny. Franny is that, which is a great way of thinking about Freud. You know, the division of self, especially since Lane also uses the term, references Freud with a capital F. It's a great sort of way of echoing ideas here. But don't focus, if you're reading this story on your own, just on what these characters are saying or how they're saying it, whether it's written down or sort of in dialogue. Think about their actions. And so I'll just talk about that for my last point here. For example, while eating, when they get to lunch, Lane takes care to finish everything on his plate. He orders frog's legs, it's snails, I think, also. And it's orderly, and he does it really well. You know, he orders a cup of coffee at the end. You know, he has this understanding of what lunch should be. You go out for lunch, you eat, take your time, you enjoy. Whereas Franny doesn't even take a bite of her chicken sandwich. And this is something that Lane, and the narrator also points out, is pretty unusual. So we can say that there is an awareness that things are going unexpectedly. Lane's preoccupied largely by the passing of time during the second half of the story, and this is because he's not the one talking anymore. He's listening to Franny, and he's a little bit uncomfortable with Franny speaking, which is, again, another really great thing in the 20th century where a lot of people were talking about how it was uncomfortable to listen to women speak. And this is, again, that misogyny that existed in a great deal when, especially, there were women's colleges and men's colleges, and the sharing of ideas between men and women was still considered unconventional as well. So it's a great little point of historical accuracy, I think, to talk about a feminist criticism of this story as well. Similarly, since Lane isn't talking during the second part, his attention is drawn to that pale, strange sandwich, the chicken sandwich, untouched in front of Franny. She doesn't eat it at all, of course. Lane is only concerned with how things should be during lunch. And so it's natural to view Franny's chicken sandwich and her not eating that sandwich as an act of rebellion in the eyes of Lane, but also in the eyes of the narrative. You know, they're at lunch, they're supposed to eat. Lane's eating, but Franny isn't eating. She isn't playing ball. You know, she isn't being a good sport, I guess. Quote, "This is going to be a real little doll of a weekend," says Lane. And then another one where he says, "A chicken sandwich, for God's sake," you know. And in this idea, he's saying, I'm taking you to a nice place. Why the hell would you order a chicken sandwich? But a rebellion against who? You know, what exactly is Franny at the core? Is she rebelling against herself? Is she rebelling against the conforming and eating a nice lunch? Is she even hungry? Is she starving herself? Does she drink the milk that she orders with it? There are so many interesting questions to think about what's actually going on, which is, putting us in the mind of Lane, thinking, what could you just tell me what's wrong with you? It's a great way of inhabiting how Lane might be feeling here. And besides, Lane doesn't know if Franny is not just simply unwilling to eat the sandwich, or if she's being stubborn. This question of self-control, of comportment and determination, of like, you ordered the sandwich, by God, you're going to eat that sandwich. He's kind of forcing her at some points. When Lane is waiting outside in the cold for the train to arrive, for example, he knows that he doesn't need to be outside. He could be in the waiting room, but he wants to sort of suffer because it's a way of expressing things are worthwhile. Things are the way they are. You do what you plan to do. You wanted to wait out by the train. You wanted to see her right as soon as she steps off. That's what you're going to commit to. Whereas Franny is a little bit more fluid. She doesn't play by the rules always. So let the final idea of this story, again, a great story. It's about 30 pages long. I highly recommend reading it, getting a sense of it on your own, is this. The characters focus on two kinds of acts, intentional and unintentional acts, or planned and unplanned. Even with planning and expectations, sometimes they end up falling apart, and the plans fall apart. Yet Franny and Lane want explanations, and Salinger's narrator wants us to notice when things are not going as expected, and for us to think, why aren't they going as expected? What's happened? Why? We think about the quote here, "You haven't even touched your goddamn sandwich," says Lane suddenly. "You know that?" he tells Franny. He's asking Franny, but he's asking also us, the reader. Like, did you notice that she hasn't eaten her sandwich at all? Don't you think that's strange? Shouldn't we talk about that? So Salinger's story, although illustrating a microcosm of mid-Atlantic and New England life during the mid-20th century, captures and expresses adroitly this Franny's fear of losing control of her life. And I know that's a big statement, but it's not just that. And she's haunted by a life with no direction, no free will, no authenticity. Perfect mid-century ideas to consider. She wants to be in love, yet as soon as she gets in the cab, we learn that her feelings are false. Quote, "I've missed you," she says. The words were no sooner out of her mouth or out than she realized that she didn't mean them at all, end quote. So her soul, if we can think about this, as she talks about, religious Russian literature, in this case, at the end of the story, is driven by guilt. It's angst-ridden. She feels trapped for the weekend with a boy that she doesn't have feelings for anymore. And so Salinger's narrator drives the nail into the coffin with this last idea, and Lane, to spoil the story here, and again, it's not really much of a spoil. It's a great story. Please read it. Franny gets up near the end of lunch, walks over to the bar and faints. She wakes up, comes to. Lane has carried her with the help of one of the waiters to the restaurant manager's office, where then Lane tells her, don't move, stay still. And although she does, in the spiritual, mystical way she's learned from the Russian book, which she's carried her with her in her bag, that she does move, but she only moves her lips in some sort of voiceless prayer, praying, one assumes, for some sort of like answer or clarity or peace. And it's this last thing that Lane tells her, don't move. She can't move, whether it's symbolic or whether it's physical. She shouldn't move because he's telling her not to move. Whether she's trapped, she's physically stuck, metaphorically stuck. It's a great way that Salinger ends this story. And that's all I've got for you. I highly recommend checking the story out for yourself. I have this beautiful copy, Penguin edition. It comes with, and again, it was also published with the, Franny and Zoe, or this other story, like a companion piece of the Glass family. I highly, 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 highly recommend reading, if you can, Catcher in the Rye. If you don't have the time for it, read Franny. And thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it.